Hello, and welcome to Your Access Smart Talks.
The Smart Talks podcast series is an EU-funded Euraccess project, which provides information and assistance to researchers at any career stage.
Euraccess supports the European research area in its ambition to create a single, borderless market for research, innovation, and technology across the EU.
We support researchers in mobility, careers within and beyond academia, innovation, and entrepreneurship.
We strive to enhance scientific collaboration between Europe and the world. Today, Your Access Smart Talks podcast has an honor to host Professor Robbert Dijkgraaf, who served as Director and Leon Levy Professor of the Institute for Advanced Study from 2012 to 2022. He was sworn in as Minister of Education, Culture and Science of the Netherlands by King Willem Alexander on January 10, 2022. Professor Dijkgraaf is a mathematical physicist who has made significant contributions to string theory and the advancement of science education. His research focuses on the interface between mathematics and particle physics. In addition to finding surprising and deep connections between matrix models, typological string theory, and supersymmetric quantum field theory, Professor Dijkgraaf has developed precise formulas for the counting of bound states that explain the entropy of certain black holes. We will try to explore and understand how a researcher could find himself in the field of politics, prepare for it, and adjust, as well as contribute to the social well-being, bridging two worldviews that sometimes are juxtaposed, scientific and political. Hello, Robert. You are very welcome on our podcast. Thank you very much for finding time for us. We are honored and happy to see you here. And let's start from the very beginning. So could you share the story of how your journey in science and education began?
Well, it began in a very simple background. I'm from a family where actually nobody went to university. I grew up in a little suburb in the Netherlands. And I was a very curious young boy, so I was always reading and looking at things. I had my own little laboratory in the attic of our house. And it's basically only when I was like 15, 16 that I discovered there was something called science. You know, I had usually perfect grades at school, but I wasn't aware that this is an open-ended field. And it was basically at my high school that some of the teachers gave me books which were, going much more advanced. So I was the typical young boy who was at high school already studying in quantum mechanics and general relativity, but just on my own. I had no idea what the life of science was. I'd never seen a university. But I was a person who dreamt about this. So I had dreams of, spending, as I like to say, a future where you only had to eat desserts, only things that you really liked. And so I think that's often I feel when I was in my teenage years, I was perhaps the purest scientist, but in a little bubble of myself. And then I moved to university, and that was also a little bit of a rough awakening, but because certainly there are courses, there's a curriculum, you have to fit in. I actually didn't fit in really well, and I kind of lost most of my interest in studying physics, and then did something crazy because I went to art school, but because I wanted to become a painter. I somehow I had another dream. And then when I was in art school, I certainly realized, wait a moment, it's so wonderful to explore and to make things and be creative. And why can't I be creative in science too? And then I decided to come back to physics.
Give it another chance.
But completely different approach. I didn't go to courses, or I just started to do research with some of my friends at university, and then it went really very fast. So before you know, No, and in science, you can be the world expert on a teeny tiny field.
Yes, exactly.
So there was a very small field and I really tried in science always to follow um, my kind of intuition and do what brought me great pleasure. And it's wonderful if you can do something that you both like and you're good at. And I felt, science was for me the thing.
Oh my gosh, if this is not encouraging, then I don't know what is actually. Because, I have read somewhere that someone stated that real education is when your grandfather went to the university, then your father went to the university, and now you are at the university. This is what probably most people think of, that this is generational, something that is built on already great basis, but you crushed right now this theory.
Well, actually, I've been I had the wonderful pleasure to be at some really exciting academic destinations. So I was for 10 years the director of the Institute for Advanced Study, the place where Einstein worked, Oppenheimer, all those great figures. So I've seen a lot of particular young people who arrive at these these are the top destinations. And I've seen again and again that they come from very far, that quite often they have nobody in the family is interested, say, in mathematics or something, and they are a brilliant mathematician. And I have a little theory that if you come from far, you can go far, because there is no place that you already have been told where you should arrive. So often I notice that these young talents, they cross the finish line, but nobody told them there was a finish line, so they just keep on going. And also I think what I felt very strongly from the very beginning. I remember being still in high school, and I was reading an article. I think it was in the Scientific American, and this was an English class, so I had to do something, a presentation in English. So I bought an English magazine, English language magazine, it was the Scientific American, and I was reading it. And the first surprise is that I could understand it because the physics was not so difficult. But the second was that I saw that these articles were often written by, say, three people, one from America, one from Canada, one from Japan. And I was thinking, is this even possible? Is there something in the world where people from different countries, different backgrounds can work on the same thing? And I think, we are too often, we think in terms of where we come from, what our roots are, where our family, our home is. But actually, you can also think about your destinations, where do you want to arrive? And I've seen again and again that if you arrive at academic destinations, I saw people from very different backgrounds, all having the feeling that they got home, that this was the place that I dreamt of. I remember the first time I went to Princeton. As I said, I'd never seen a university until I went to college. But I always had the dream. I had this idea, it's somewhere in the woods, and there is this beautiful building, and people are only thinking. And then, 30 years later, you actually are at that place. And I think, wow, I visualized this place. And that's a very powerful tool, I think, visualizing where your future could be. And often I felt, the biggest gift that my parents gave me is that they really didn't have a message. I didn't have instructions where I should go. So I was kind of set free. And that freedom, I think, was a terrific gift. And I think it's something that we need in education, because there is such an inner force in young children, and actually in every adult too, an inner force of wanting to learn and wanting to explore. And often I feel, I like to say, we all have you can switch on your curiosity and imagination. You just have to prevent that people switch it off. And I think that's often what happens in education, that the natural, the idea, and I think it's true, that every child is born as a scientist, as a little explorer. They try everything. They ask the brutal questions, very difficult questions. And then education often, tells them not to fit in. And I think it's the great human power to not fit in and to push the boundary. And if there's one place where you're pushing boundaries, of course, it's in research, because by definition, you're dealing with the unknown.
Yes, and very difficult tasks, I would say, that like 90% you are not succeeding in them. And only but you still keep on going doing this. This
But
is a tricky thing.
this was for me the most important lesson when I was in art school. Because in art, there's not the thing called succeeding. Because what does it mean to succeed? In mathematics, it's clear. You solve the equation, something. Or in
Exactly.
physics, you have the theory, and experiment fits in. But in art, it's about exploring. And what I learned in art school was that at the end of the week, the thing that really mattered is how much exploring did you do? How high is the pile of drawings? What kind of material? I mean, are you proud of yourself, of what you have been exploring? And when I went back to physics, that's the attitude I brought with me. And I felt, well, it's not so important to do something original or succeed. It's much more important to own the subject, to make it your own. So if you read something in the textbook, well, clearly there's no challenge to proving that because it's already known. But
Yeah.
can you do it yourself on your own terms? And there's this famous physicist, Richard Feynman, he said, I can't really understand something if I haven't kind of made it myself, if I haven't, produced the result myself. It's not about the outcomes, it's about the process. And I think this was for me an incredibly important lesson. And then the success rate, well, that's the difficulty in science. I think, if I look at my own career and I see how many really successful breakthroughs did I have, really brilliant ideas. Well, perhaps 5 or something, once every decade or something. So if you wait for those moments,
Not bad.
then actually, no, honestly, that's a pretty good. And of course, it's wonderful to meet people who have like hundreds. But even they are not driven by success. They're driven by just the pleasure of exploration, and that should give you pleasure. And even if you're not hitting your result, you've learned something. You perhaps have learned what didn't work, and that's good too.
Oh, this is a kind of attitude a lot of researchers should learn,
Well, if you
So,
educate, I mean, that's you're quite right. And one thing I find very frustrating that when I was a student or a young researcher, nobody ever told me this. No, I
yeah.
think the way you are being educated is very much, well, you need results. You have to work the next step in your career. You need these and these and these results. And it's very easy to get very stressed uh, to hear these instructions. It's like a game and you want to win the game.
Hmm.
And it's almost, it should be more like amateur sports, where it's not about winning the game, but just the pleasure of playing.
Yeah.
And it's very zen, but I feel once you are in this mode where you enjoy the pleasure, the results will come.
Great message, I would say. But how did what actually influenced your this field that you choose? Why mathematics? Why physics?
Well, I think that's the most amazing thing. So I'm really a person who's very curious, and I like every branch of science, but actually to work in it, I feel you're an instrument. Your mind is an instrument that only resonates with a particular tone. So it's like very, very sharply tuned. So I love physics. I love particle physics. I love mathematical particle physics. And if I just change my subject like in the 10th decimal, then I find it still interesting, but I wouldn't do it myself. No,
Okay.
it's like and I think I've seen this, also with students, that often they're going to do what they're told to do, but they're not really resonating with it. So, they get some enthusiasm, but not the real enthusiasm. So I always feel, you have an inner voice. There's something in you which really likes something, so that you as I said, it's like eating desserts. It's not eating your vegetables or something. They're good for you, but there is something that you give you immense pleasure just to do that. That you feel, well, if I could today think about that, that actually would be wonderful. That would be like very relaxing, and that's something that you have to discover, and you can't find it immediately. So it's also very important to recognize that something is interesting, but not that interesting, and move on. And at some point, you might find your destination. And some people are almost born with already the idea of what they want to do. Others take a longer time. But I think there is something waiting for you as your subject. And I think science is this wonderful combination where it's your own inner drive that kind of hits an objective world where you can actually make an impact. And once these two things come together, then a click is formed in your mind, and then you will find kind of extra resources of energy. Actually, you will recharge while doing work instead of that your battery becomes empty. Your battery actually fills up by just doing that.
Oh, this is great. Of course, I got an advice from my supervisor when preparing scientific paper. So she told me, I see clearly that you are very fond of your, as I'm in SSH, so of your theme, but I need a solid methodology.
Yeah, of course, there is also, as I said, it's a confrontation of two fields. So, I could dream of, finding a grand unified theory of how the cosmos works, but this has to match what is known. Mathematical formulas have their own character; they have their own will. They want to go in a certain direction. You can't push them. So it's that's another lesson actually I learned in art school. In art school, they learned me that I was taught that a material has its own kind of will. So if you make something out of paper or you make something out of glass, they want different forms to be made out. So you have to respect the material. And I think if you're a scientist and you work in a certain field or a scholar, you have to respect the material. If you're a historian, history wants to be written in a certain way. So there might be methodology or something, and you have to embrace that. But ideally, it's this kind of combination. The material wants to flow in a certain direction, and you want to flow in the same direction. And if that happy coincidence, takes place, it gives you tremendous pleasure. Now, as I said to you, it's quite rare where you really have this perfect lineup. But then the wonderful thing is, and I had the pleasure of experiencing this once or twice, that you do something and it's almost like the beginning of an avalanche, right? So you do something and you have an idea, and then the material, the field itself, clearly wants to move in that direction. And you feel, I often say, sometimes you discover a formula that is smarter than yourself. So the formula wants to do much more. And then you see, wow, I brought this formula alive, but it has a life of its own and it wants to do much more. And then your colleagues, you say, well, it's good that you discovered this, but, we can generalize in this and that direction. And they go and run with it. And that gives you tremendous pleasure, right? It feels that, I think that's another experience you have as a scientist, that you're working with something that is so much larger than yourself.
Oh yeah, this is great.
Body of knowledge is out there. We just know that this big unknown. So there's this famous, saying, I think of Newton, who said that he was wandering along the beach and he found a few pebbles that were nicer than others, but he was very much aware of this infinite ocean of unknown facts that was still stretching out in front of them. So I think there's this kind of almost like sublime experience where you as human being can actually deal with something that is orders of magnitudes bigger than you are. and so you have to respect that. So otherwise you become a crackpot.
Yeah.
It becomes more astrology or something. It's in your imagination you can do everything, but it's the wonderful thing that your imagination is actually capturing a part of reality.
Oh, yeah, this is the philosophy of physics. But nothing in science comes still easy. It's a process that is very demanding, and there definitely are a lot of different challenges. And have you seen? I have read one paper that explores on our new methodology that is evaluating us as a scientists, and if we would apply this methodology to, for example, Einstein, he would do pretty badly with the Hirsch index and publications, etc. So this is pretty much challenging. If up to 19, I would say 70, usually people, when they were telling about their scientific endeavor, they would state definitely something about their students, that they
Yes.
handed out this knowledge to their students, that they moved them into this path. Uh, how would you address it, or your reflections on that? What was it when you were in early stage as an
Yes.
early stage researchers? What was the focus then and now, probably, like, in comparison?
Well, I think what you mentioned, the rise of metrics, the Hirsch index in particular, I think they did a lot of damage, honestly. I
Okay.
think actually, first of all, I think it's important to realize that this is self-inflicted. That is to say, it's not government officials who thought of the H index. Actually, it was sociologists, or science people studying the science system, and I think it creates a very one-dimensional image of science. And I think for me, the great pleasure of science, it has kind of this maximum biodiversity. There are so many different approaches, there's so many different roles. And if I look at the development of science, which has grown spectacular, actually, science itself as a subject has grown exponentially, just the number of people and complexity of the subjects and the wide variety of tools and observations. And so it's, I think, very detrimental that at the same time, we're going to measure science in a more and more limited way. So we are kind of counting instead of weighing the contributions. And I think it's very good that I think there's now a counter movement. There are many funding agencies, particularly young scientists, who say, well, this whole movement of recognizing and rewarding different styles of science, different elements. But I think you're quite right that this was something that was more informal and therefore captured more the spirit of science than it does right now. So as I said, I was for a long time director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and it prides to recruit the brightest scientists and scholars around the world, and it doesn't use any of these measures. It's I think it's the most risk-taking organization where you tried actually to counter that trend, because the bad thing is, first of all, it's restricting and eliminating, I would say, a lot of natural diversity in science. So it's kind of focusing, creating a monoculture, and it does something else. It forces a lot of people to do the same kind of science. So you get like a regression to the mean.
Yeah.
The natural broad width of the scientific effort is being focused and doesn't make sense. So I think we're coming back from that, but it is a real challenge. When science has become so much more professional. In Einstein's time,
Yeah.
it's really interesting. He moved to Princeton and he was in Berlin, and you can ask, well, what kind of position did he have in Berlin? Well, he was director of the what's now called the Max Planck Institute for Physics, and that had exactly one employee, which was him. So he was a professor at the academy, which meant nothing. So he just had an income and he could do whatever he do. that situation is very hard to recreate when you spend like billions of euros of tax money. And so we need accountability, but we shouldn't lose the spirit of science. And I think we have, you know, it's often what they said about economists, right? That they know the price of everything, but the value of nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's a little bit like this. If you and we see, of course, a lot of pervasive, wrong behavior where people are scheming the system, etc. And as I said, it's tragic that young people often ask, tell me, what are the games? How do I make a career? If it's the H index, let it be, and then I'm gonna optimize that. And that might give predictable careers, but I think it will not help improve science. And this kind of spirit of science and the freedom that's part of it, and that's necessary to explore the great unknown. It's very hard to be captured in these metrics. Somebody used the term "les mesurables," because
Yeah.
poor young scientists that are measured all the time. And you ask, how was it when I was a young scientist? And it's really interesting to see the possibilities, quite generally, funding possibilities, career possibilities for the young scientists growing up in the 1980s, like me, were roughly twice as good as they are currently. So, that's not a good thing. While we need science even more, so in terms of funding, in terms of predictability, in certain fields takes a long, long time before you actually become an independent researcher. I think that's all a very negative development that we have to stop.
But I know that things are changing exactly as you stated, and ERC grants, that is the grant for excellent science, are really now more deeply looking into your activity as a scientist than in just only Hirsch index, etc. But still talking about your challenging path. So it was science, then art school, then science again, and then policy.
Yes.
How was it?
Well, there's policy, there's politics. So,
yes.
So I've been involved with policy once I became president of the Academy of Science in the Netherlands, and then I became co-president of what's called the Inter-Academy Partnership, which is the alliance of all science academies in the world. And that was my first experience with that other world, namely the world of politics, of policy, where decisions are being made. And I was really kind of surprised how difficult it is to get the voice of science being heard. So it's also, what I found really the positive thing is, of course, that if you look at the number of subjects, questions, issues, challenges where science is necessary, they're growing quite rapidly. So there's, I would say, tremendous opportunity for science to play an active role. So this is not so much like policy for science, which is like Hirsch index, etc. It's science for policy. Now, what can the scientific community do for society? And if you want to do something for society, then a very important venue is, of course, to influence policies. And that means that for one thing, you really have to learn about what the demands are on the other side. So often I think of science and policy as two different worlds, so there's quite a big gap.
Yeah.
And you need to build a bridge. And my experience is that in order to build a bridge, you need bridge heads. So you need places where the bridge starts and ends. And so on the part of science, I think, we have quite some well-developed structures. So I already mentioned academies, a lot of like advisory bodies. Every country has a different setup. The EU has yet another setup. Worldwide has yet another setup. But so there are many scientists who are quite passionate about bringing their scientific knowledge, for the greater good. I think this is something I see, particularly young scientists. They get very energetic. if they feel, well, they can actually contribute to the serious challenges that we have. So I think there's quite a well-developed bridgehead on the part of science. But I think my observation is really the receiving end. So in terms of governments, intergovernmental organizations, who is there to actually listen to the advice of science, take the advice and do something with it? And I think that's where I feel, well, depends very much on which country and which organization, but often there is a lack of deep understanding of how science works to able to listen to the voice of science. And I think that's something that has to be strengthened. And one way it can be strengthened, by the way, is more scientists going into policy and politics, right? They can move to the other end. And if you, and there are a few, and I always see that, that's incredibly useful. If there's something, somebody on the other side of the gap that can receive. Because I think it's one thing that you really have to start to appreciate, that these are different worlds, right? So if you compare, say, science with politics, science is win-win. Politics is usually a zero-sum game, right? So I want in science, we think in terms of the long term. Politics, sometimes 24 hours could be short time, right?
Yes, exactly.
And for instance, you could have a very sensible advice, but politics is often quite frozen, and there are brief moments when it becomes fluid, and things move. For instance, if there's new government, or if there is,
we are accepting new budget.
Exactly. And so often what people in politics says that, well, this is wonderful advice of scientists, but it's often too early or too late.
Yes, exactly. You should be on time.
And the concept of time is absolutely crucial for politics. So first of all, I think, there's always an expiration date to everybody, I think. And in science, actually, it's not, right? So if you think we want to understand the cosmos, well, I'm going to try, but I'm not sure. I can't guarantee I'll get a result in a week. And I think that's something I started to appreciate more. That the way, and certainly when I moved to politics myself, that it's people often ask me, since I was a minister of science, how does it feel to be in this illogical, irrational world? And that's completely wrong. I think the world of policy and politics is rational. It has its own laws, its own mechanisms.
And rationality also.
But it's a different rationality. Just as science and scholarship has its own rationality. And I think, from the point of view of the general public, I think both worlds are equally mysterious. Right? It's very difficult to sympathize, with or really understand how science works if you're, a policeman or a truck driver or or an educator,
or just simply not interested in this subject. Yeah.
Yes, and I think what I noticed that actually, if you're in politics, you meet a lot of people who are equally passionate and want to understand the system. As they are in science, but it's really two completely different worlds. And I mean, there's some sense they're really complementary in the sense that Niels Bohr had this, the quantum physicist has this idea of complementarity. Like if you want to think about an electron, you can think of it as a particle, or you can think of it as a wave, but you can't think of it at both at the same time. And both perspectives are valuable. But for some questions, it helps to think of electrons as particles, and for other questions, it helps to think of electrons as waves. And I feel in the same way, if you think about the world, it's very successful and to think of it from the perspective of science. And there are many things you can answer, but certain things you cannot even understand. And in politics, you really have to take this complementary point of view.
Yeah, but then quantum physics kicks in, and then everything.
Exactly. Yes, I wish there was something like.
And this is the wave and the light and everything in one.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, but
there's no Schrödinger equation for science and policy.
you know, but still, okay. Let's proceed with this, if I may, with
Yes,
these metaphors from science. So Schrödinger's cat, also, is he alive or dead? We can check it only if we open the box.
yes,
And you have opened this book.
exactly.
So tell me, please, honestly, is this cat alive? I mean, I mean, policy has its definite rules, and
Yes,
probably you were. I'm not sure. I'm just supposing here, like thinking out loud, as an intruder from the science. So lobbying like science rules and approaches, probably implementing them into the
yes,
politics,
yes,
and uh, this is the one perspective that we see here. So in order to make some reforms, you need to bring people on the same page.
yes.
How difficult it was? Actually, this is one point. And the second one, what I would like to ask you, as a minister, you have to collaborate with very different ministries. And if the Ministry of Science and Education, at least you know this this ecosystem of it, then how was it with other ministries? And
Yes.
which ministries are most difficult?
Well, to start with, the last thing, the most difficult ministry is always the Ministry of Finance, because
Oh yeah, the
the
guys with the
Ministry of
money.
Finance, Minister of Finance is it learns to say no in 50 different shapes.
Ways.
Well, I always said, the Minister of Education and Science always says yes, right? Because it's so we're like opposite.
Yeah.
I must say, I really did feel when I joined as a scientist the government, I still felt I was a scientist. No, that attitude you cannot change.
Yeah.
One of my favorite book titles is from Oliver Sacks. It's An Anthropologist on Mars, and I felt a little bit like an anthropologist studying the dynamics, because it's, as I said, there is a mechanism, and it's interesting to study, and to just like you study the laws of nature. So it's I found it really interesting to ask questions and observe, and try to really work with the system. I felt that one thing that is done very little in politics is what you do in science, particularly in my field, in fundamental physics, is ask the deep questions. No, you ask, why are we doing this? This is a question rarely asked. You do it because last week there was something which made you do it or something. So just what I like to call in my old life as a working physicist is clean the blackboard and just have somebody from scratch describe why are we asking this question? What is the true thing there? And what are the various options we have? And that's the divergent part in science. And people in politics are very, very scared of the divergent phase because they want to converge as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm.
No. Let's try something else, if only for a few weeks. And I felt this was extremely useful to do. A second part was that as a minister, I was often to see I'm making the policy for science. But I felt, wait a moment, I'm also a scientist. So also want to do science for policy. So in the cabinet, when we're discussing climate change or discussing agriculture or water quality, I felt I had to have a voice, because come on, there's a lot of scientists who want. So I felt I could be that bridgehead. And this meant that my colleagues had to get used, like the minister of health was also a professor, so he knew this. So he said, "Oh, it's wonderful. At least there are two scientists, so we can work together."
Great.
It's an observation is that many branches of government are these days dealing with science. In fact, also the Minister of Finance, because he does only have to worry about expenditures. He also has to worry how are we actually earning money? How do we get returns on our investment? And in fact, it's about innovation policy. So him too. And in fact, there's a lot of science who actually can help sharpen your mind. So I also felt, as a minister, I tried to become an advocate for the role of science. And then my experience was the best way to collaborate with my colleagues is on the content. So if they're worried about what's happening with AI, and they from either a legal or perspective, or from an innovation perspective, want to talk about this, how wonderful to actually sit around the table and have this open conversation where these various different perspectives come together. So for me, I think in politics, the same as in science, the best way to start a conversation, to start a collaboration, is your common interest in a certain question.
That's great. But, taking into consideration, as we usually perceive politicians, they have their inner interest sometimes.
Oh, definitely, yes.
They are humans, But
and it's a zero-sum game. It's a zero-sum game. So
yes,
in the end, politics is a very brutal game that's, I would say, completely orthogonal to the win-win attitude that science has.
Yeah. So, but looking back at your time as Minister of Science and Education, what accomplishment are you most proud of, and why?
Well, the easy answer would have been that I was able to spend a lot of money supporting research, etc. But I think the honest answer is what I'm most proud of is that I felt I was responsible for all forms of tertiary education. So including vocational and technical training, where roughly half the high school students go into in the Netherlands. And I experienced that, on Monday, I would talk about various issues in universities. And then on Tuesday, I would have the same conversations about University of Applied Science, like the polytechnics. And then on Wednesday, I would have the same conversation with vocational training. And I would say, wait a moment, why I have these different tracks? And which are not only different in content, but different in public appreciation, in status, in how students were supported. Even student grants were unequal. So I discovered, there's a very unequal system in the Netherlands in how we deal with tertiary education. And so being a theoretical physicist that always works on the grand unified theory of the universe, I think we have a grand unified theory of education. And why can't we deal with all those forms of education in the same way? And often it's presented as a ladder. You climb up, and that's your status in society. We talk about highly educated and lowly educated people, and I felt, can we just flip that image? And I tried to speak about basically, a broad, in the Dutch word would be a fan. So that it's something that you a big spectrum of education that's not vertical but horizontal, where these various forms of education lie next to each other instead of on top of each other. And I've tried to advocate for that, and a lot of my policies were in that direction. And I think it was successful also because I was seen, I'm still probably seen, as the most academic of academics, right? This from this, when it was announced that I became a Minister of Education, there was a cartoon in the newspaper. You saw me descending from a little planet called Princeton. There was an ivory tower, and I was going into a big black hole that was called politics. And I think actually that image with the ivory tower and the ladder, that's actually this stairways going down. That's exactly the image I wanted to destroy, so to say. And I noticed that effort, thinking, if you think about what education can really do, I said it can liberate young people, right? It can set free your imagination. It can set free your curiosity. You can advance. Whatever you do, you can advance. Whatever. That's not only true for the various kinds of science and scholarship, but that's for everything we do. In anything, you can be an expert. This message I have for scientists: find your inner voice. and find your inner path and follow your inner compass. That's something that should be true for everyone, not only for those who go into science. Everybody should have the feeling that they're only eating desserts, that they're doing. So that is the message I most strongly try to speak about. And that's not so much. Of course, in the end, it's policies, and I was happy that I could implement a lot of laws that even this kind of hierarchical thinking. But actually, I also noticed that the way you speak about it and the words you use are just as important. So, if I think I'm most proud that I was able to bring this, which for me is a very essential feeling, that you're born with this tremendous gift of finding your own way and building your own life, and you have this tremendous power and source of inspiration in yourself that only has to be kind of lighted, so it has to be kind of activated. That's true for every student. I think that was what I was most proud of.
Great, thank you very much. It could be the end of our conversation, but I have a couple of more questions. May
Yes.
I? Great. May I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
When you were at the academy, together with other scientists, we have a strong network. We have our themes to discuss. We have really strong friendship links.
Yes.
And now you switch to the to the policy.
Yeah.
What about these links? Definitely, you was able to support these relationships that you had previously. But now you are a big person, leader. Everyone wants to be a friend with you, etc. And you have very different people there.
Yes.
So someone are super educated, someone have their own values, maybe
Yes.
probably
Yes.
different from your ones. How you balanced it? Was it challenging? How was it?
Well, I think actually one thing I discovered, and this was also, I think, true for my life in the academic world, is that now the best way to build friendships is to do something together, right?
Yeah,
So
this is great,
honestly,
definitely.
and I often felt that there were people asking, are your colleagues your friends? And I felt, well, they're both. In fact, the friendship is closer because it's like you're traveling together, right?
Yeah.
You're sitting in the same bus. You're going to the same destination. That actually deepens the friendship because your work and your personality in science, your personal life and your working life often coincide, because you travel to destinations because of your work, but it's also your personal travel. So I noticed in politics that the key to build these relationships, like in the Dutch parliament at my time, we had 20 different political parties. So you will have 20 relationships already with all the spokespersons. Again, I think what worked well for me, and I also got this often as a feedback. I got a feedback from Parliament that said, "Oh, Robbert is really interesting because he's always listening. He's always paying attention." And even if I was sitting with the whole cabinet, then everybody was reading their papers, and I was the only one actually looking at the speaker. And this might be a little bit naive, but I felt this is for me. It's the content that actually builds the relationships, and I also noticed this within the ministry, and the Ministry of Education is very large. It's like 5,000 people work in the Netherlands. That it's often the younger people who are more the early phase of a career who have most to say, are most interesting to say. And again, I try to bring some of the things that worked well in my scientific career into politics. For instance, have a brainstorm, let everybody speak their minds. If you're 20 something or you're 60 something, perhaps the 20 something has a better understanding. So indeed, there is a big diversity of people to deal with. And clearly there are nasty elements to politics, let's agree. But also there are nasty elements to science. We have to be honest too. And it can also be very brutal. Science also is sometimes, you can say, well, it's win-win, but if there's a prestigious professorship, either I get it or somebody else. So it takes quite something to be in a win-win mode then and be enjoying the success of others. So there's some similarity there, but I think for me the recipe always has been start with the content and see how people resonate with that. And if they do not resonate with it, then it will be very difficult for me to build a friendship. But if they resonate with the message, then at least that's a basis to build relationships. So I think I, so to say, try to find out whether there is some kind of a like-minded spirit. And the remarkable thing in politics, this is not something that you know in advance, because the political color of somebody, for instance, if you talk about education, there's no political party that says we don't care about education.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the question is, do they really care? No,
Yeah.
Are they really passionate? I said nobody's against education, but are you for it? And this often depends on people's personal point of view. And you could have people in political parties that are like completely the opposite in terms of your own ideology, but people care very deeply about education. And then I felt, okay, now I have a basis to build a relationship. And I think I built some really good friendships, or a combination of collegiality and friendship, with some people who I remember who were like politically opposite. And I remember very well, one of those members of parliament, that the very first day I met him, he said, "Oh, I really like you, Robert, as a scientist, and you did a lot of like public lectures on television. But now I have to hate you because you're from another political party." I said, "Well, go easy on that."
I like this metaphor of you like traveling, but sometimes it looks like hell. Some people hate flying because they cannot stop the flight in the middle and tell, "No, I'm off, guys. Right now, I cannot proceed with that." But you still need to do that to deliver the results.
I think you have to stay true to yourself, right? And again, in politics, there are moments where success is very well defined. So if you have your proposals, and when you have a parliamentary majority, and it becomes a law, and in fact, you have to go over many, many hurdles, because you have to convince your colleagues in the cabinet, you have to convince, the lower house, the higher house, and it's like baking a cake. You have to have many, many different steps. But once it's all done, you take the cake out of the oven, or the law is, the law of the land. That gives a tremendous feeling of accomplishment, right? Because it's very difficult to turn it back.
Yeah.
It really makes a change. So, for instance, I was very happy I could reintroduce in the Netherlands grants for every student in university, that they were abolished a couple of years ago. We brought them back. And then I felt, wow, this is quite something. That means, it's hard cash for all the students. It starts next month. It's, it's the law of the land. It's very hard to read. And it gave for me the same sense of accomplishment when I, discovered the mathematical formula that really was working, So yes, and then together, you have to sometimes go through tough phases. So you have to convince people, but sometimes you have to do a little power play. You need everything that's there. You really have to make use of every instrument. But again, as I said, one of the deep lessons I learned is you have to work with the material.
Yes,
and politics is made out of a different material than science. So you have to appreciate it. You cannot it will not do something against its own will. So and I think this is also something that as a scientist you learn, is really appreciate the mechanism and work with it, because it has its own laws, and you will have to obey those laws. And then the question is, under those conditions, can you become successful? And clearly, there are some kind of less pleasant parts of the process, but I think is something that's necessary because it's part of how politics works.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Really, I'm so grateful for this talk. We have already 53 minutes right now, but I have an impression like it was 5 minutes ago we just started. I can proceed. I have a lot of questions. Really, you opened so many dimensions, and maybe I would probably like to torture you a little bit more about these practical things. Yeah. But still, we have, at least for now, we have to stop. And one takeaway from this conversation from my side would be really the message from you is endure this life with a touch of curiosity. Thank you very much.
More than a touch.
Okay, this definitely has a broader impact.
Yes, exactly. I like to say that, we human beings, we have two superpowers, which is our imagination. We can think of things that aren't here yet. And then we have our curiosity to find out whether we can actually make that imagined world reality. And this is something everybody has, and it's something that we cannot make enough use of, I think.
Thank you very much, Robbert.
It's a pleasure. It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Euraccess Smart Talks.
We hope you enjoyed this episode and can't wait to share more with you next time.
You can follow us and find more episodes on the Euraccess portal or wherever you listen to podcasts.
This episode was prepared by audio engineer Pavle Drašković, outreach manager Daria Aksionova, production manager Jacob Wiesenfeld, editors Isar Pier and Miroslav Trajanovic.
This episode is published under the Creative Commons CC BY license.
Thanks for listening.